Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today to honor one of our favorite weeks at the Journalism Institute, Sunshine Week. I'm Beth Francesco, Executive Director for the National Press Club Journalism Institute. As the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, the Institute's mission is to power journalism in the public interest. We are so glad that you're here for today's program. Whenever the Institute has hosted FOIA or open records training programs before, we get a lot of questions about today's topics. Steps to take when your FOIA requests are denied or delayed. Before we get started, I'll kick off with a few housekeeping items. We have a live transcription option available to you at any time during the program. The instructions will be in the chat momentarily. We'll also be recording the program, and a link to the video will be emailed to you afterwards. So if you missed something or want to go back and review, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. Highlights from the program will also appear on our website and in our newsletter with the video. If you aren't already receiving our daily newsletter for journalists, it's free, and you can subscribe now. I think Bara's going to put that in the chat. Today's program is designed as a conversation, and we hope that you're going to join in with comments and questions throughout. Please go ahead and drop in the chat where you're tuning in from if you haven't already. And during the conversation, we would really appreciate it if you shared your questions in the chat, not in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring them there. So now let's get to the program. The reason you're here. In a perfect world, any journalist or member of the public filing open records requests would get prompt, thorough, timely response to their requests, but all in the service of greater good, the greater public good. But we don't live in a perfect world, as you know. Instead, we often see long waits, heavy redactions, and sometimes no response at all. So what do you do when your requests lack adequate fulfillment or are just flat out denied? What does an appeals process look like? And what resources do we need to go after the information that we want? These are questions that we hear often. We are so fortunate to have three experts in this area with us today. Please welcome Nate Jones, FOIA Director at the Washington Post, Gunita Singh, Staff Attorney for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and last but definitely not least, Mark Walker, Investigative Reporter at the New York Times, former President of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Group, and a National Press Club board member. Gunita, Mark, Nate, thanks so much for joining us today. So I thought we might start at the start. How do we get our request correct? How can we write our requests in a way that encourage prompt and thorough responses? You each assist journalists with your colleagues and do much of this work yourself in getting public information requests. So I thought we'd start with some of the common mistakes that you've come across that can lead to delays or denials. Nate, will you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do two quick points. The first is it can be a little bit confusing because it's called the Freedom of Information Act, but the law is very clear, and most state laws are also very clear that you actually have to request records, not information. So the first step is getting in a records point of mind. Or way of mind, and think about records. So you have to pretty much be able to point to the document you want. I know my esteemed colleagues can talk more about that. The other quick point is that if someone says you call them on the phone or you do an email asking for records and they say we don't give that out, push back, say please put that in writing and cite the statute and give me my appeal and litigation rights. And you'll be kind of surprised at how often when they have to put it in writing, I think this might be a theme today, their tune changes a little bit.
Mark, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to build off of that and say that in addition to those 2 points, I think that we want to be as precise as possible in the language that we're using, because in a perfect world, we wouldn't even need to go through this process in the first instance, but obviously not every single record we're interested in is being proactively published in an easy to navigate, user-friendly, portal online. So when tailoring the language of your records request, there is definitely a bit of a trade-off between the scope of the records you're seeking and the timeliness of your response. So if you have the ability to be as precise as possible with keywords and with date ranges, or maybe you've had the opportunity to peruse the agency's organizational chart and you have an intuition of what specific records custodians are going to be the most relevant, definitely include that at the outset in your records request.
Excellent advice.
And I'll hop in to sort of build on what Gunita was talking about. Every word matters in your FOIA request. We spend a lot of time talking about how when you're reporting, when you're writing your lead and your story, every single word matters. It's very critical when you're putting together your FOIA request. Any one word can be the difference in getting records or not getting records. A typical example I run into is often keyword searches, where a reporter will have a set of keywords and in their request they write, can you find any emails with the following keywords? And it'll be 15 keywords. The agency will wait 3 months, come back and say, sorry, we had no request, we have no records for that. What they did was run a search and try to find any emails with all 15 keywords. And so obviously nothing will come up. But changing it to saying any one of these keywords will turns out we end up getting 500, 1,000, 2,000 records back. And so that can be any piece of just wording or structure. You're talking to these FOIA officers, and I often say like they're 5-year-olds. So right, you're talking to them, you're breaking this down, and you're being as simple as possible, and you're building a map that walks them from point A to point B. So precision is really, really key here. And sometimes that takes actual reporting and putting some reporting into your FOIA request so you really understand precisely what you're looking for.
Talk to us about the pitfalls of the any and all request, any and all information request. I think that kind of hits at some of what you've already said, but I know especially for journalists getting started with open records requests, it can be very tempting to do a very broad scope. So talk to us about those and what the pitfalls are there.
Yeah, I can start briefly. Generally, they're not good requests because it signals that you're not being precise. It signals kind of like what Mark talked about. You didn't really do your research. A much better request is a follow the footnotes approach. A much better, in my opinion, would be instead of any and all records, it would be this record cited on this page in the attached PDF. So the FOIA processor will know exactly where to look and where to get it. So I always say narrow is better. So any and all is not narrow. It's really very broad.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I usually refer to the two types of requests that can be made as the targeted request and the exploratory request. The targeted request, I think it's kind of rare that we get to be in this situation. It's a situation where maybe you have a source who comes to you and says, I was the recipient of this email on this date, here's the timestamp. But if I give this to you, it could burn me as a source, but why don't you go ahead and request it through FOIA? So that's a situation where you're able to include the subject line, the sender, the recipient, the timestamp, et cetera. But it's not every day that we're so lucky to submit a targeted request. But even if you submit an exploratory request, which is a bit more of a fishing expedition, you're submitting the request in the hopes of finding something interesting, you still need to satisfy the specificity requirement of the relevant law. And under federal FOIA, the requirement is the request has to be reasonably described. So the visual that comes to mind when I'm thinking, okay, what's a reasonably described request is, am I holding the FOIA officer's hand through this process, right? Depending on the agency, they're getting maybe dozens, if not hundreds of requests in a day or a week. So if they want to be able to understand, okay, this is the records custodian I'm going to forward this off to. And if you put the FOIA officer's hat on your head and you read the request from their point of view and it's not that intuitive, maybe it's time to rework it to use some of those tools of precision that my co-panelists were just referring to.
Yeah, and if you're trying to get records, especially in a timely fashion, that is not the way to go, just in any and all. And I'll give an example of like a FOIA I edited recently. Last year was like any and all records related to like Norfolk Southern. The FRA immediately picked up the phone and called me and was like, you want everything we have on Norfolk Southern? And I'm like, no, let me take that back and I'll put in a better one because it's that could be millions of records. They don't know what I'm looking for. I don't give off the confidence that I know exactly what I'm looking for. They can do all this also. Like it's relationship building. Why would you make someone do hundreds of hours of work, and you may never write a story because you don't know specifically what you're looking for. And so they're also going to look at you as a requester and say, this person makes us do a lot of work for nothing. We want to be helpful. We want to try and do these requests in a timely fashion. And so you're helping them and you're helping yourself, and you're building a better relationship with the FOIA officers by trying to have some level of precision.
Mark, I love that you talked about the relationship, because that's something that you've said to institute audiences before, and you've had success in building strong relationships with records officers. And to Gunita's point earlier, in a perfect world, we would just be able to call and ask for the records that we need. How can we nurture those relationships that can sometimes feel very adversarial with FOIA officers, or records officers, I should say? And yes, how can we nurture those relationships without neglecting the information that we're really trying to get to?
Yeah, I look at it as any other source relationship. I pick up the phone, I call them, I send emails. Sometimes I periodically check in. I ask them for coffee. And I try to say, I'm just here to make your job. Like, they know who you are. Like, the FAA, the Department of Transportation, like, they all know who the three of us are. And so they see us by, like, okay, here's Nate. He's sending another request in. Here's Mark. We expect that to happen again. And so picking up the phone and calling them, introducing yourself, trying to develop a relationship with someone who knows you very well from the amount of work you assign them, and just like asking for coffee, saying, hey, what am I doing? Sometimes I go and say, am I doing something wrong in my FOIA request? Is there an issue here that like I'm not seeing that's making your job harder? And a lot of times, surprisingly, they're open to that. And they was like, well, you usually do this, and like that means I have to go do A, B, and C, or we're pretty fast. You do expedited processing that puts an extra layer on top of it. Review, you don't need to do that. We can probably get it to you much sooner if you like took that off. And so where certain agencies I do it, certain agencies I don't. And I've had success to where requests that take some reporters months to get, I'm able to get in weeks, just by like having a better rapport and being able to work that out. And also it comes in handy when you need to negotiate records as well.
If you don't mind, I see a question that I think is directly related to what Mark was just saying. It's a question from Corinne about a best practice for revising a request without having to refile. And I think that the kind of foundation that Mark just laid, it perfectly dovetails with at least my recommendation for answering that question, which is, I think for journalists in particular, one of the main, perspectives that folks are introduced to in J school, for example, is having like a healthy skepticism of institutions. And I certainly couldn't do what I do as a FOIA litigator without that healthy skepticism. So I get that, and I co-sign it. But I also want to highlight that the three of us have on occasion been at what's called the ASAP conference, the American Society of Access Professionals conference, where we've had the opportunity to really interact face-to-face with federal FOIA officers whose job it is to receive your request and then process it in accordance with the law to the best of their ability. And 9 out of 10 times, I genuinely believe that these are public servants who genuinely want to strike that balance between giving you the records you're entitled to under the law while also keeping things manageable for the agency. Because a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, they're getting dozens, if not hundreds of FOIA requests in a given week. And so I think that a best practice, at least from my perspective, and I definitely want to hear from Mark and Nate in terms of revising as a request, is having the FOIA officer connect you with a SME, a subject matter expert, and get their perspective about how to strike that perfect balance between getting what you need for your investigative reporting while also keeping things manageable for the agency. I mean, sometimes it's not going to be that simple, and sometimes you do just need to litigate and be aggressive and move to the front of the queue, especially if you're under the pressure of a deadline. But if it's a situation where there's just such profound information asymmetry, and that's why you're leaning on the FOIA requesting process in the first instance, but you don't have enough information to maybe be as precise as you would ordinarily be with your keywords and your date ranges, hop on the phone with them, engage in that relationship building that Mark was just talking about to come to that compromise.
Yeah, so two quick thoughts. On in general, I'm glad Gunita brought up the term SME, which is subject matter expert, and something that took me a while to learn, and I'm glad to share it, is that most of the delays in FOIA are not the FOIA people that we and you are emailing with. They're trying to get the records. If you look under the hood, and it's kind of a secret, is them trying to get the records from the SMEs. So the FOIA people that we know can't really, in most cases, can't search agency records. They have to beg and nag and plead with these subject matter experts, which just means normal government employee, that are busy negotiating or busy fighting wars and are not paid to do FOIA. FOIA is not really in their job description, and they are the people often that ignore and don't send the records and cause the delays. And the requester and the FOIA people talk. So if you have that anger, do not misplace it at the FOIA person. It is probably someone else in the agency that's causing that delay. And kind of 101, sugar is better than vinegar always. Don't be angry ever. But just know that it's not the FOIA people that are doing the delays. It's other people in the agency, and I would say 9 out of 10 times or even more. On the technical question for Karine, in federal FOIA, it happens more often than not. It's usually not hard. Just an email to someone saying, I would like to amend my request to XYZ. I have not had problems with agencies changing that. Most of the time I amend it to make it smaller and easier for them. It might be a little bit different if you try and amend it to make it bigger. But generally, just an email saying we'll also talk today about magic words. The magic word in this one's just amending the request in an email. Almost always works for me.
That's great. Thank you so much. This is such terrific advice. I'd like to move along to the appeals process itself, the focus of our talk today. So let's say that somebody has filed, what we think to be a strong records request. They've been specific. They got it to the right agency. They knew which record they were looking for, and then they're told the information falls under an exemption that maybe you don't think it should. What are some of the first steps, when deciding what you should do in that situation? Gunita, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So first, I would make sure that you just understand the contours of the relevant law. If you're operating under federal FOIA, then ordinarily you have 90 calendar days from the time you're given a determination, which is, it has a specific legal meaning. That's when the agency communicates to you what they intend to withhold and what they intend to produce. But if you're operating within a given state, so not the federal level, you'll definitely want to consult the Reporters Committee's Open Government Guide, which has the ins and outs of all 50 states plus DC's public records laws, because each of the states plus DC does have a public records law. And some of them are modeled off of the federal FOIA, and there aren't going to be too many points of convergence, but some of them are super different. So just keep in mind that if you're doing state level records requests, I would say about a third of the 50 states don't have a formal provision for administrative appeals. But again, I said formal provision. There's never anything stopping you from just hopping on the phone with the public information officer. Say if you're requesting states under the records under the California Public Records Act, there's no formal statutory provision for administrative appeals, but send them an email, hop on the phone with them. If you have a productive phone call and you kind of elucidate where you think the records are going to be, stored, send a follow-up email memorializing that conversation just to ensure that there's some accountability there. And then in the remaining states, there's either a formal administrative appeal mechanism where the agency itself can take another pass at the propriety of their withholdings, or there's some third party, whether it's the state attorney general or an ombuds office. If you're in Indiana, for example, it's called the public access counselor. Sometimes they vary by name, but the general principle is the same, that it's just kind of taking another pass and acting as a liaison between the agency and the requester. But, the handful of things that could trigger your intuition to kind of push back are if you get a record that's heavily redacted. And you think the redactions haven't been adequately justified, or maybe the agency is saying, oh, we're just going to wholesale withhold everything. Under federal FOIA and the vast majority of the states, there's something called a duty of segregability, which means that if there are only portions of a record that are exempt, the agency cannot just wholesale withhold the entire thing. They need to redact the portions they contend are exempt and then promptly produce the remainder. And then another thing I'll note is that under federal FOIA and some of the states, a delay constitutes a constructive denial, which you can administratively appeal. And just in terms of expectation setting, I'll note that appealing a delay is not guaranteed to get you a more swift response, but it's a great way to try to ping the agency into compliance and remind them that you are a reporter doing work squarely in the public interest. You're not just a tracking number assigned to a request.
I have two more. I'll jump on two more things. So, kind of Gunita's theme, I think, was very good. So often reporters or requesters think that you can only appeal denials like citing exemption 1, exemption 3, or redactions. But in the federal FOIA in many states, you can appeal delay, like we talked about. Very important. You can appeal no records responses. So I think that's one of the most underutilized and most important at the federal level, is if an agency comes back and says, we have no records, you can say, I find that an adverse determination. Again, that's a magic word. The federal law says that you can appeal any adverse determination. And that's kind of powerful because that allows the requester to generally decide what is an adverse determination. So you say, I find your search to be an adverse determination. Did you search here, 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 and here? Who searched? What record systems did you search? Again, it would have been better or best if you say that on the front end and you don't have to appeal. But if you get a no records response and you think there's a record, appeal, don't let it go. And then one other quite useful appeal is also denial of expedited processing. So if you're a reporter and you're in a deadline, sometimes it's expedited, simple track, you're in good shape. Complex track, with many agencies, you're in bad shape. You might even have to give up or lawsuit. So you really want to get in that simple track. And if you're not in there, I would strongly consider doing an appeal to have someone higher up review your request for expedited processing and make sure the initial person didn't make a mistake.
Mark, would you like to add anything?
Always appeal. That's easy. Yeah.
Yes. So what resources do journalists and the public have, or do you turn to personally when you're kind of working through the appeals process? I mean, you're all experts in these areas, but for those who are less familiar with the process, what are some resources that they can turn to?
For federal appeals, definitely the FOIA wiki. That's just foia.wiki. And I know that someone from the Journalism Institute already popped that in the chat, but absolutely bookmark that if you're a frequent requester, because my colleague Adam Marshall at the Reporters Committee is the person who initially devised it, but we're continually updating it as there are changes of the law that we want requesters to be aware of that could help them in the process, or changes in the law that, might pose a difficulty for requesters, but we still want you guys to be aware of them so you can best navigate them. And if you're appealing at the state level, definitely, once again, check out the Reporters Committee Open Government Guide, because it's going to have important tips on timing. So, for example, at the federal level, it's kind of convenient because there's, 20 business days where the agency initially has to provide you with a determination. And then after you appeal, again, it's, for the sake of consistency, 20 business days, usually, wherein they need to get you a response to your administrative appeal. And if they blow that deadline, then you can, try to tee things up for litigation. But there's a lot of variation at the state level. And I'll just provide a handful of examples now so you can become aware how important it is to keep spreadsheets and set reminders on your phone just to stay aware of deadlines, especially if you're doing multi-jurisdictional requests to try to cover your bases. You know, in Alaska, for example, an agency needs to respond to your appeal as soon as practicable, but in any event, no later than 10 days after you send your appeal. But in Connecticut, the agency has up to a year for the Freedom of Information Commission to respond. And then in DC, where I live and work, it's 5 days. So there's a ton of variation. And staying organized, again, with spreadsheets and just setting calendar alerts is absolutely essential for staying on top of the agency, for fostering that accountability, and for ensuring that you know when something is ripe for litigation.
I would love for Nate or Mark or both of you to describe how you stay organized with all of the different requests that you have going out.
I'd love to hear Mark's trade secrets, but mine's rudimentary. A spreadsheet. Essentially, it has date filed, address, is the request acknowledged. Doesn't have to do with appeal, but one pitfall is when you send the request, you think you're done, but the agency doesn't acknowledge it. So you have to double check in maybe a few days or maybe a week that they acknowledged. When's the deadline? Did they meet the deadline? Did I choose to appeal that they missed the deadline? Were the documents released? Did I appeal the document release? And then notes. And then the last thing I would say is sometimes requests get complicated and they send them around to different agencies or refer them or consult them. It's confusing if you keep that as one request. Anytime another agency goes to anytime a request goes to another agency, I just create a new, just do a new line, treat it as a new request, and that will make your life a lot easier.
I use a spreadsheet as well. So one of the things I do to try and keep track of them for particular projects is I have a column in there that I call for slugs. And so then I also sort of like group my FOIAs also like thematically. And so if I'm like working on a specific project, each FOIA request will have like when I was working on like COVID stuff, I would slug certain requests, COVID, I would slug certain requests, just different things. And so then I filter down and sort of parse through the FOIAs to just say, I want to look at where all my COVID FOIAs at. How are they shaping up? I want to look at how all my policing FOIAs, like where they're at. So I do that to like, you end up building this massive spreadsheet, which sometimes can be discouraging the longer and longer it gets to just like scroll through and keep track of it. So one of the things I do is I do the slugging and then I have like a column set up that sort of notifies me when it's been like 20 days. So like I have something that like will change a column from one color to another once the 20-day period hits, and have some just kind of like things set up in my to like better keep track of things.
I really want to see these spreadsheets. I want to see them so badly, but we know that they are works in progress. We have a question from Jack in the chat. Is there any way on appeals to pierce the veil of redaction related to protected internal emails? If the government employees in questions were caught acting in bad faith on FOIA items that snuck through unredacted, does that change the calculus?
I'll answer that but I also want to go back to the previous question about resources. But for this answer, I would say yes, definitely appeal. I think that the calculus. So if that happened to me, this is what I would do. I would go to FOIA.wiki and I would see the exemption that they use to redact the emails, and it probably my spidey sense says it's probably exemption 5 pre-decisional. So I'd go there on the FOIA wiki, and then it would do a very good job saying, here are the top court cases from the Supreme Court all down on what can and cannot be withheld. So I'd get a little one sentence synthesis of the law, or maybe a couple sentences, and say, does this seem right or not? And if it's a gray area, argue that it's not right. Add common sense facts, being like, you're probably redacting stuff that's already in the public domain. You're probably redacting stuff that shows bad faith. Then also the FOIA wiki will show that since 2016, The FOIA now has a provision that says that you have to show harm before you withhold something for most exemptions. So you could also pretty much copy and paste the citation from there. So that's how I would treat that. I will note that at the Washington Post, the number one thing my colleagues ask me to help them file is emails. And at all of my list of good FOIAs, emails is pretty close to the bottom because these exemptions in courts, at least on the federal level, have made it very easy for the federal government to withhold. I hate it. Congress has to do something about it, maybe the courts. But right now, the state of play is it's hard to get emails. States are a little bit different. But on resources, I want to name two more resources. So the FOIA wiki is very great. That's where I go. But the government, on the government side, that maybe is center government, is the DOJ FOIA guide, which is also good, and check it out. And it's similar to the FOIA wiki. They do a good job reading all the cases and synthesizing them. The government says that it's right down the middle. I think it's a little bit more pro withholding, but know your enemy. And then also, if you can go to muckrock.com, which is a site that allows you to do requests. It's good for that. I don't use it. But what I do use it for is there are thousands and tens of thousands of requests online. And I think you can do a button that says appealed requests. Then you can go and read other people's appeals. And if it's a successful appeal, even better. And then you can replicate that. One last point. I just want to, sorry to monopolize. So the reason that appealing is so important, and why Mark said always appeal, is that the Associated Press did a survey a little bit a while ago, but the numbers showed, if you think of a pie graph, of all appeals, 1/3 of all appeals, the requester won, which is actually quite a lot. It means that in 1/3 of all the time, the government wrongly withheld information. But of all of the FOIA requests to the federal government, only about 1% were appealed. So if you extrapolate that out, that's potentially millions and millions and millions of pages and cases of stuff that the government is wrongly withholding on the first crack. And the stats show that if you go and push back on the second crack, you have a good chance of winning. The reason for that, and I'm wrapping up, is that it takes a higher up person, usually a government lawyer, to sign their name and say, I am signing my name saying that this should be withheld, for example. And they often think long or twice about that in review, and that's why your chance of winning an appeal is quite high, in my opinion.
The only thing I'd add to that is I request processing notes sometimes when I have concerns about how my FOIA was handled, or if I have something in my reporting that shows that I should have gotten more, or like they are withholding something that I know shouldn't be exempt from the law. I put in a request asking specifically for the processing notes surrounding my specific FOIA, and I put the FOIA number in there. And there have been times where like I found very interesting things. A quick example I give is like Sharpie Gate, when I like put in the FOIA to figure out when Trump drew the additional hurricane map on it. I put the processing notes to figure out what was going on there, and got some stuff back to show like the White House at one point stepped in and took the request because they wanted to review it to make sure that what was being sent out didn't make the president look silly. And so there was some interesting back and forth, and that's how I learned why it was being held up, is because of a White House review, and we ended up putting it in a story that the White House took the documents. And so sometimes that actually helps you out a lot.
Really good point. So let's get at some of the questions that we have in the chat are around legal action. And so I'd like to kind of turn from, once you've exhausted what you feel, as far as you can go with appeals, at what point do you turn to legal action, and what kind of support is out there for journalists in that regard?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when an agency blows through their statutory deadline, that certainly does trigger your ability to litigate. And litigation is great. It moves you to the top of the queue. So I saw a few times in the chat, folks were talking about, agencies getting back to the requester and saying, oh, this is going to take months, this is going to take years. I mean, it's unfortunate, but that happens all the time. And FOIA was amended in 2007 to allow the requester to ask for and then receive what's called an EDC, an estimated date of completion. But this happens so often and I saw this mostly during COVID, but it still happens where that estimated date of completion, you kind of check online and it just keeps changing on a daily basis or weekly basis to just, further extend that estimated date of completion. And it's really frustrating. And sometimes the only thing you can do is appeal, is to litigate. So at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, we offer all of our litigation services to members of the news media at an entirely pro bono basis. So we don't charge a penny for anything we do. And obviously we wish we could help everyone, but we can't help everyone. So the entities that usually tend to meet our litigation priorities are, freelancers or individuals who work at lesser resourced, usually nonprofit newsrooms instead of the larger, more established outlets that have a budget for offensive or defensive litigation. But I'll note that I saw someone earlier say that they're from Pennsylvania, and it'd be really great to see kind of like an outline of where everyone is tuning in from. But we do have an attorney who is based in Pennsylvania as part of our local legal initiative. We also have attorneys who are based in Tennessee and Colorado and Oklahoma. And we are expanding it also to Indiana. So we do hope to continue it to expand to just, meet the needs that are out there for public records support, but also we do things like court access and defamation defense. And, even if we ourselves can't help you, we get a lot of requests through our hotline, which is staffed 7 days a week by attorneys like myself who say, listen, I don't really need to litigate this, but I would love for some help in sending a demand letter or a letter of intent to sue to kind of scare the agency a little bit. Can you help us? We can't help you if we're not licensed to practice in that given state, but we have a pretty vast network and would be happy to do our absolute best to connect you to other media lawyers in the space who would be able to assist.
I might just add really quickly that I know that getting a lawyer seems like a big idea and seems expensive, and it's never easy. But if you're fighting for important public records, even if you're an under-researched news organization, I would not rule it out. A couple of reasons. One, at the federal level and many states, again, about a third of the states, have a thing called fee shifting, which means that if you win or substantially prevail at the federal level, and the agency has to pay your attorney's fees. And it's a bit of a gamble, but there are attorneys out there that will take that gamble. They'll look at your case, say, I think we got a winner, let's go. So that cuts down on the cost immensely. And then I would also add, if you're going after records that are in the public interest, don't give up on legal clinics. There are lots of universities that exist to help with this. And then don't give up on white shoe firms pro bono. If you're a lawyer, you're supposed to do 50 hours of pro bono work a year, and firms especially have to do that. And they like having people do this because it gives younger attorneys a chance to actually litigate on something kind of fun and go in front of a judge. So I've been at places that have had lots of pro bono support from big firms. So there are options out there that will not necessarily break your bank or might be free, in addition to all of the great work of Reporters Committee.
Yeah, I think all those are great answers. I mean, for one thing, you'll realize if you FOIA enough, you'll get a sense of like what you're going to have to sue for. It'd be like sometimes like I know like before I even put in a request and like we're going to have to sue like immediately. It's the only way we're going to get this. And so I think that's the great opportunity to engage. Reporters Committee of Freedom of the Press, and just reach out and talk to the attorneys that kind of understand like what you're getting yourself into. Also, you want to, in that case, when you're going to litigate, you want to have someone look at that request before you put it in, especially if you know this is the route you're going into. You want to make sure there's no mistakes. You're going to make sure you ask for the right thing, because I will tell you, the worst thing you can do as a reporter to these guys is to put them in court and make them look silly in front of a judge because of a mistake you made. That's not great. And, part of continuously like doing litigation is that building a reputation of like when you go after things and when you pursue this big step that like you're delivering and you're like setting everybody up for success. So I think that goes back to a lot of the points that we've talked about today is when you get to the point of litigating, how critical it is to be precise, how critical it is to research, to know exactly what you're asking for and going for, because we're not the ones who have to go sit up there and argue and fight for that thing. And so like it's on us to do our jobs on the back end, on the front end to make sure that these requests are set up right.
Mark, can we go back to something you said at the beginning of your comment, which was sometimes you file requests and you're going to have to go to litigation. What are some of those topics that kind of trigger that thought for you?
The State Department in general is an agency. There's certain agencies that you're not, if you want the records in a timely fashion, you're going to have to like sue for them. If you want certain law enforcement records from like DOJ and things like that, like if you want them in a timely fashion, your best option is to sue. You can look at sort of like the reports that come out where they sort of review FOIA, how long it's taken to get a request done, things like that. You'll see it takes years sometimes. And if I'm suing for records related to something if I want records related to something that's in the news from one of these like agencies, everybody is like going to FOIA. And so there's probably 1,000 FOIAs related to the same thing. I need to get ahead of the line. And so I need to make a decision on like to do that. I'm going to have to sue to get those documents timely. And so, strategically, I think a lot of the things that like we talk about is strategy. There's a lot of strategy and finesse that goes into doing FOIA work. And so like you think strategically of how you want to handle certain things. And those are ones that's like I use the State Department all the time because that is the one I never go to the State Department unless we plan to sue because I know it's going to be 10 years before I get anything. Like that's one if we're going to go do this, everybody should just cuddle up and we all work on this FOIA and make sure it's perfectly crafted because we're going to court.
Understood. Well, I'm looking at the time. We don't have a whole lot, we don't have very much time left, but I thought we could end on some positives and thank you to the panelists for taking questions in the chat and responding there. Unfortunately, we never have enough time to get to everybody's questions. But I thought we might end today, just given that it's Friday of Sunshine Week, with some wins, some FOIA wins. So I wondered, Gunita, Nate, and Mark, if you would mind sharing a win you're particularly proud of.
Yeah, I'll offer one from the state level. So we were trying to get records for a small nonprofit that was looking at incidents of fatalities and use of force within the Kentucky. This was in Kentucky, and it was looking at law enforcement agencies across that particular state. And they were just getting stonewalled left and right. So we filed several demand letters on their behalf, and they were fortunately able to get rolling productions that they used for their investigative reporting. And they created some very impactful reporting. This was the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting in conjunction with the Marshall Project, two amazing, outstanding outlets. And I definitely encourage you to look at their work.
I'll do a flippant one and a serious one. So a while back, we were talking about the dreaded Exemption 5 deliberative, and I did an appeal, pretty much what we talked about. There's one box in the margin of a document, and once the box was revealed, below the box said, "What a bunch of BS," although they spelled it out in handwriting pointing to it. So that's just a joke, but it shows the kind of true feelings that sometimes are hidden by redactions, that by fighting and appealing, you can see what the government's actually thinking when it makes policy. A more recent serious one is we got that General Mattis was, he said that he received a standard honorarium to talk to the United Arab Emirates, but after fighting and getting the redaction removed, that standard honorarium was $100,000.
Yeah, I'll do a quick one. One of the first FOIAs I got back once I got assigned to like be like the investigative transportation reporter was Amtrak had its worst year yet and got a FOIA back that despite it having their worst year yet, their executives paid record bonuses to each other across the board and was able to see anywhere between $500,000 to $1 million in bonuses were given out for having the worst year on record for Amtrak. And that was a FOIA that we got back and wrote about.
Oh my goodness. Well, definitely some great ones to share. And I know each of you has many more. I want to say thank you so much to Gunita, to Nate, to Mark. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And Gunita, if you could share our respect and admiration for the entire Reporters Committee, Freedom of the Press group. And we're just so thankful for all of the work that you do for journalists around the country. Each of you packed so much into this 45 minutes. It went by so fast. We want to thank all of the participants for your great questions and your comments. We will share a link to the video soon, along with the resources that were included in the chat and a few other links that we have for you, so that you can keep mining this conversation for guidance. Thank you all again for being here and your commitment to shining light on government activity. Happy Sunshine Week, and we hope to see you at another Journalism Institute event soon. Thanks so much and have a great weekend ahead.